The mirrors had to go first. David Bowie stood in the master bedroom of his Doheny Drive mansion, staring at his reflection, and felt nothing but terror. The face looking back at him wasn't his own anymore. It belonged to someone else. Something else. The thin white Duke smiled back at him with hollow eyes and skeletal cheekbones, and Bowie couldn't remember the last time he'd seen David Jones in that mirror. So he covered them all, every reflective surface in the house. Aluminum foil, bed sheets, anything that would make the stranger disappear. But covering the mirrors didn't stop the voices. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in May when Tony Visconti knocked on the door. Bowie's longtime producer had received a frantic call from the house staff. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The curtains had been drawn for weeks. The only light came from candles arranged in strange patterns on the floor. And David hadn't slept in 4 days. Maybe 5. Time had stopped meaning anything in that house. When Visconti finally got inside, what he found would haunt him for decades. The man who answered the door looked like David Bowie. Same sharp features, same frame. But everything else was gone. This person moved differently, spoke differently, thought differently. "David's not here," the figure said in a flat, emotionless voice. "He left a long time ago." Visconti felt his blood turn cold. He'd worked with Bowie through the Ziggy years, through the madness of fame and the pressure of constant reinvention. But this was something new. This was a complete disconnection from reality itself. And the worst part? Bowie wasn't joking. He genuinely couldn't remember who David Jones was anymore. Before we go deeper into that terrifying night, let me ask you something. If you're watching this because you lived through the Bowie era, if you remember the shock of Ziggy Stardust or the strange beauty of the Berlin years, subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in 1976 wasn't just a breakdown. It was the night David Bowie nearly ceased to exist. And the full story has never been told until now. To understand that night, we have to go back. Back to 1974, when the cracks first started showing. Bowie had killed Ziggy Stardust on stage at Hammersmith Odeon in July 1973. But killing a character doesn't mean it dies. Ziggy had burrowed deep into his psyche, taking up residence in the parts of Bowie's mind that used to belong to David Jones. And when Ziggy left, he didn't leave alone. He took pieces of Bowie with him. The man who emerged after Hammersmith was different, haunted, searching for something he couldn't name. The Diamond Dogs tour of 1974 was spectacle incarnated. Massive set pieces, theatrical lighting, choreographed chaos. But backstage, the chaos was real. Bowie was consuming cocaine at an alarming rate, sometimes going through 1/8 of an ounce in a single day. The drug did something to his perception of reality. It made the characters he played feel more real than the man playing them. During the tour, crew members reported hearing Bowie talking to himself in different voices, not rehearsing, actually conversing with people who weren't there. He would argue with Ziggy, debate with Aladdin Sane, receive instructions from entities he claimed were watching him. By the time the tour ended and Bowie relocated to Los Angeles, the City of Angels became his personal hell. The house on Doheny Drive was supposed to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became a prison. The California sun felt like an attack. Bowie would only go out at night, driving aimlessly through Hollywood, picking up strangers, bringing them back to the house for rambling conversations about occultism, UFOs, and the end of the world. He was reading Aleister Crowley obsessively, drawing protective circles on the floor, convinced that dark forces were trying to steal his soul. And maybe, in a way, they already had. Angie Bowie, his wife, had largely given up trying to reach him. Their marriage had become a business arrangement held together by contracts and public appearances. She stayed in London with their son Duncan, while David descended deeper into the Los Angeles abyss. When she did visit, she barely recognized him. He'd lost nearly 30 pounds. His diet consisted of red peppers, cocaine, and milk. That's it. Nothing else. His body was eating itself from the inside out, and his mind was following suit. Friends who came to visit left shaken. Mick Jagger stopped by one evening in April and found Bowie sitting on the floor surrounded by candles, speaking in a language Jagger didn't recognize. When asked what he was doing, Bowie looked up with eyes that held no recognition and said, "Keeping them out." Keeping who out? Bowie never explained, but his paranoia was metastasizing. He believed the house was bugged. He thought people were plotting against him. He was convinced that Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin's guitarist and fellow occult enthusiast, had placed a curse on him. The rational part of Bowie's mind, the part that belonged to David Jones from Brixton, was buried under layers of characters, drugs, and delusions. And then came the night Tony Visconti received the call. May 11th, 1976. The date matters because it was the night everything collapsed. Visconti had been working with Bowie on the Station to Station album, and he'd noticed the deterioration. But artists are allowed to be eccentric. Genius often walks hand in hand with madness. What Visconti didn't know was just how far Bowie had fallen into that madness. The call came from Pat Gibbons, Bowie's assistant. Her voice was shaking. "You need to come now. Something's happened. David's not David anymore." Visconti drove from his hotel to Doheny Drive in 20 minutes. The house looked dead from the outside. Every curtain drawn, no lights visible. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. After 5 minutes, the door opened a crack. The face that peered out was gaunt, almost translucent in the dim light. "Yes?" The voice was cold, aristocratic, the thin white Duke's voice. "Tony Visconti, I'm here to see David." The figure at the door tilted its head, studying him. "David isn't here. Would you like to come in anyway?" What Visconti found inside was a scene from a nightmare carefully arranged into reality. The living room had been transformed into something between an occult shrine and a paranoid bunker. All the mirrors were covered. Candles burned in geometric patterns on the floor. Books on Kabbalah, Nazi mysticism, and Egyptian mythology were scattered everywhere. And sitting in the center of it all, cross-legged on the floor, was David Bowie. Except it wasn't David Bowie. The body was his, but everything else belonged to the character he'd been inhabiting, the thin white Duke, the emotionless, fascist, cocaine-fueled persona from the Station to Station album. And that persona had taken complete control. "Where's David?" Visconti asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The Duke smiled. "David is sleeping. He was very tired. He played so many people for so long. Ziggy, Aladdin, Halloween Jack, all those masks. They were exhausting him. So I told him to rest, and he did. Now I'm here." Visconti felt his stomach turn. This wasn't method acting. This wasn't preparation for a performance. This was a complete dissociative break. Bowie had fragmented. The characters he'd created to protect himself from the pressure of fame, from the expectations of the world, from his own fears and insecurities, those characters had become autonomous. And David Jones, the real person underneath, had retreated so deep that he couldn't find his way back. Visconti sat down on the floor across from him, trying to assess the situation. "How long has David been sleeping?" The Duke considered this. "Days, maybe weeks." Time is strange here. Do you feel it? The way the house breathes? The way the walls listen? Visconti didn't feel any of that. What he felt was fear, not for himself, but for his friend. Because somewhere inside this hollow-eyed stranger, David Bowie was trapped. And Visconti had no idea how to bring him back. They talked for hours. Or rather, the Duke talked, and Visconti listened. The Duke spoke about power, about will, about the necessity of emotional detachment. He quoted Nietzsche, Crowley, and Hitler with equal reverence. He talked about the music as if it were a weapon, a tool for reshaping reality. And occasionally, just occasionally, there would be a flicker. A moment when the Duke's mask would slip and something human would peek through. A flash of confusion, a moment of fear. David Jones trying to remember who he was. But then the Duke would reassert control, and the moment would pass. As dawn approached, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the cocaine finally wearing off. Maybe it was some small part of David Jones fighting his way to the surface. But around 6 in the morning, Bowie blinked, really blinked. And when he opened his eyes, Visconti saw recognition. "Tony?" The voice was different now, softer, frightened. "How long have you been here?" Visconti felt relief flood through him. "A few hours. How are you feeling?" Bowie looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The candles, the books, the covered mirrors. I don't remember doing any of this. What day is it?" What followed was a conversation that Visconti would later describe as one of the most disturbing of his life. Bowie had gaps in his memory, large gaps. He remembered finishing the Station to Station album. He remembered the tour starting. But everything between February and May was fragmented. He recalled moments, images, sensations, but not as a continuous experience. It was as if someone else had been living his life, and he'd only been there for brief moments, watching through someone else's eyes. "I've been playing characters for so long," Bowie said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I forgot how to be myself, and now I'm not sure there's a self left to be." Visconti suggested getting help. A doctor, a therapist, someone who could make sense of what was happening. But Bowie refused, not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear that if he told anyone the truth, if he admitted how far he'd fallen, it would be over. His career, his life, everything he'd built. So instead, he made a different choice. He decided to leave, to run, to find somewhere far away from Los Angeles, from the cocaine, from the occult obsessions, from the characters that had colonized his mind. He decided to go to Berlin. But before he left, there was one more thing he had to do. He had to face the mirror. Visconti helped him remove the sheets and foil from the bedroom mirror. Bowie stood in front of it for a long time, staring at his reflection. And for the first time in months, he saw David Jones looking back. Thin, haunted, nearly destroyed, but there, still there. "I'm going to survive this," Bowie said, though he didn't sound convinced. "I have to." Visconti nodded. He wanted to believe it, but looking at his friend in that moment, wasted and terrified and barely holding on, he wasn't sure survival was guaranteed. The weeks following that night were a blur of desperate attempts at normalcy. Bowie continued the station-to-station tour because contractually he had no choice. But everyone around him could see that something fundamental had broken. On stage, he was magnetic, commanding, otherworldly. The thin white Duke persona translated perfectly to performance. But the moment he stepped off stage, the mask would crack. He'd retreat to his dressing room and sit in silence, staring at nothing, trying to remember who he was supposed to be when he wasn't being someone else. The most infamous incident came on May 2nd, just days before Visconti's midnight intervention, though the full story wouldn't emerge until years later. Bowie arrived at London's Victoria Station to promote the UK leg of the tour. Thousands of fans had gathered, cameras everywhere. And in a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Bowie made a gesture. His arm extended. The angle was wrong. The context was ambiguous. But to many watching, it looked like a Nazi salute. The press exploded. Was Bowie a fascist? Was this the logical conclusion of the thin white Duke character? Or was this a man so disconnected from reality that he no longer understood the weight of his own actions? Bowie would later claim it was a wave that had been misinterpreted, that the angle of the photograph made it look like something it wasn't. But people who were there remember the blankness in his eyes, the way he seemed to be moving through the world without really inhabiting it. The Duke had said he was interested in fascism as an aesthetic, as a philosophy of will and power. Had that interest become something more? Or was Bowie simply so lost in the character that he couldn't tell the difference between performance and reality anymore? The truth is probably more complicated and more disturbing. Bowie wasn't a fascist, but he'd become so detached from his own moral center that he could flirt with fascist imagery without feeling the weight of it. The cocaine, the characters, the occult obsessions, they'd all combined to create a moral vacuum, and into that vacuum, terrible things could flow. Berlin became his salvation. In September 1976, Bowie fled Los Angeles and relocated to a small apartment in Schöneberg, West Berlin. He brought Iggy Pop with him, another refugee from the Los Angeles cocaine nightmare. The two of them, both barely functional, trying to save each other. They lived like monks, simple routines, long walks, no parties, no drugs, just work. Bowie threw himself into creating the Low album with Brian Eno, and in that process, he began the slow work of reassembling himself. The Berlin trilogy, Low, Heroes, and Lodger, wasn't just a musical reinvention. It was a psychological reconstruction. Bowie was using music to remember how to be human again. But even in Berlin, the shadows followed him. He would wake up in the middle of the night convinced that the Duke was still there, waiting in the corners of his mind, ready to take control again. He developed rituals, morning runs, afternoon painting sessions, evening recording, structure to keep the chaos at bay. And slowly, very slowly, David Jones began to reemerge. Not as he had been before Ziggy, that person was gone forever, but as something new. Someone who had been through the fire and survived. Someone who understood that the characters he created weren't just costumes. They were pieces of his psyche, and if he wasn't careful, they could consume him completely. Bowie never fully escaped the thin white Duke. In interviews decades later, he would talk about that period with visible discomfort. "I was out of my mind, totally crazed," he said in a 1997 interview. "The main thing I was functioning on was mythology and religion, and that whole thing became my universe. My psyche went through the roof. It just fractured into pieces." He described arriving in Berlin and feeling like he was barely a person anymore, just a collection of characters and cocaine-fueled delusions held together by willpower and fear. The night Tony Visconti found him on the floor, unable to remember his own name, became a turning point. But it wasn't a dramatic, Hollywood-style recovery. It was slow, painful, incomplete. Bowie carried the scars of 1976 for the rest of his life. He rarely looked in mirrors unless necessary. He was careful about character creation afterward, maintaining clear boundaries between performance and self. And he never, ever returned to cocaine. The drug that had nearly destroyed him became a closed chapter, something he refused to revisit no matter the circumstances. But the question that haunted him, the question that haunted everyone who knew him during that period, was this: what if he hadn't escaped? What if Tony Visconti hadn't shown up that night? What if the Duke had maintained control? Would David Bowie have simply ceased to exist, replaced entirely by the character he'd created? Or would something worse have happened? The occult obsessions, the fascist flirtations, the complete disconnection from reality, all pointed toward a darker possibility: that Bowie might have self-destructed entirely, taking his genius with him. Instead, he survived. He made some of the greatest music of his career in the years following the breakdown. He learned to live with the fragments of his psyche, to integrate the characters, rather than being consumed by them. But he never forgot how close he came to the edge. In his final years, working on the Black Star album while dying of cancer, Bowie would sometimes reference the Duke, not with nostalgia, but with wariness. As if the Duke was still there, somewhere in the back of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. A reminder that the price of genius is eternal vigilance, that the characters we create to protect ourselves can become the very things that destroy us. What happened to David Bowie in 1976 wasn't unique, though it was uniquely public. Many performers, especially those who inhabit intense characters, struggle with dissociation. The line between self and performance blurs. The character becomes a shield, then a prison, then a replacement for the self that created it. Add cocaine psychosis to that mix, along with occult obsessions and paranoid delusions, and you have a recipe for complete psychological breakdown. Bowie's mistake wasn't creating characters. It was believing he could hide inside them forever, that he could avoid the pain and pressure of being David Jones by becoming everyone else. But eventually, the bill comes due. And when it did, Bowie nearly lost everything. The covered mirrors in the Doheny Drive house weren't just paranoia. They were a desperate attempt to avoid confrontation with the self. Because when Bowie looked in the mirror, he didn't see himself anymore. He saw the accumulation of every character he'd ever played, all fighting for control, all claiming to be the real David Bowie. And underneath them all, barely visible, was David Jones. Frightened, exhausted, nearly erased. The night Visconti helped him uncover the mirrors was the night Bowie had to choose: face the truth of what he'd become, or disappear entirely into the characters. He chose truth, barely, and it took years to recover from that choice. Today, we celebrate Bowie as a chameleon, an artist of reinvention. But we forget the cost. We forget that every transformation took something from him. That the man who could be anyone struggled to be himself. That the price of infinite possibility is the loss of singular identity. And on that night in May 1976, David Bowie paid that price in full. He stood in a house full of covered mirrors, unable to remember his own name, speaking in voices that weren't his own, and came as close to ceasing to exist as a person can come without dying. But he didn't die. He survived. He fled to Berlin, dried out, made extraordinary music, and rebuilt himself piece by piece. The Duke retreated, but never fully disappeared. You can hear him sometimes in later Bowie recordings, a coldness in the vocal, a detachment in the delivery, a reminder that the characters never fully die. They just wait. And the man who survived them all, who learned to live with the fragments of a shattered psyche, became one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Not despite the breakdown, but because of it. Because he looked into the abyss, saw what waited there, and chose to climb back out. That choice, made in the pre-dawn hours of a Los Angeles mansion by a man who couldn't remember his own name, was the moment David Bowie truly became immortal.